Every empire was built on a story. This season investigates the ones that wore the face of God. New York City, July. The offices of the United States Magazine and Democratic Review occupied a building on Nassau Street, 2 blocks from City Hall. On any given afternoon, the street outside was loud cartmen, printers, boys selling papers at a shout. Inside, it was the quiet of a place where people were choosing words carefully. A journalist named John L. O'Sullivan was writing an editorial about Texas. He was not a general, not a senator, not a man who sat in the rooms where borders were decided. He ran a magazine. His contributors included Walt Whitman and Nathaniel Hawthorne. His readers were lawyers, politicians, educated men who believed the Republic was going somewhere and wanted language for the direction. He wrote 11 words. 11 words that would be used in the decade that follows to justify the dispossession of millions of people, the invasion of a sovereign nation, and the drawing of a border that still exists today. The words, our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. The United States had been expanding westward for decades. The Louisiana Purchase, Itzimbabe Sen, the Floridas, Itzimbabe Isjo, Texas, under negotiation at the very moment O'Sullivan was writing, and what came with every acquisition, inseparable from its removal, the forced displacement of the peoples who had been living in those territories before any European drew a line across them. The Trail of Tears was 7 years old, not history yet. News. It required explanation, not apology. The political culture of 1845 had no architecture for that. It required a narrative, something that could take what the country had done and place it inside a story that felt consistent with the values the Republic claimed to hold. O'Sullivan gave it that narrative, in 11 words. 3 years after O'Sullivan wrote those words, the United States went to war with Mexico. 18 months after that war ended, it had acquired over 500,000 square miles what is now California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. 150,000 Mexicans became residents of a different country overnight. They had not moved. The border moved through them. The indigenous nations of the ceded territory, the Navajo, Apache, Comanche, Pueblo peoples, and dozens of others were not mentioned in the treaty that ended the war. They had not been consulted when Mexico held the land. They were not consulted now. All of it was, according to the dominant narrative of the time, inevitable, destined, ordained. This is a story about how a narrative like that gets made and what it costs the people it makes invisible. The United States in 1845 was 69 years old. It had been arguing, almost continuously, about a gap, the gap between what the Republic said it was and what the Republic was actually doing. What it said it was, a nation founded on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What it was doing, acquiring territory by force and displacing the people who lived there. Every political speech about westward expansion had to navigate this gap. The expansion was popular broadly, genuinely popular among white American voters. The displacement was harder to discuss. It had been contested at every level in Congress, in missionary pamphlets, in courtrooms, but the contest had not produced an answer that the political mainstream could comfortably repeat. O'Sullivan's phrase was that answer. John Lewis O'Sullivan was born in 1813 on a ship in the Atlantic. the son of an American diplomat whose postings took the family to England, France, and Gibraltar. He came back to the United States with the perspective of someone who had understood it from a slight remove, someone who had thought deliberately about what it meant to be American, rather than simply assuming it. He founded the Democratic Review in 1837. By the mid-1840s, it was one of the most widely read political magazines in the country. He was genuinely not a cynical man. He did not sit down one afternoon and think, how do I construct a justification for dispossession powerful enough to last? He sat down and wrote what he believed, and what he believed was that the United States was a country unlike any that had existed before. Not just more democratic, providentially different, chosen by the Protestant God of the Puritan settlers and the evangelical revivalists now sweeping the country in the Second Great Awakening, for a specific mission: to demonstrate to the world that self-government was possible. To demonstrate this, it needed the continent. That was the gap his phrase was filling. The Second Great Awakening had restructured how Americans understood salvation. The older Calvinist framework said whether you were saved or damned was decided before your birth fixed, predetermined, beyond human influence. The revivalists rejected this entirely. Salvation was available to anyone. Anyone could choose God. Anyone could be redeemed. This sounds like private religious news, but it had a political consequence that was not immediately obvious. If individuals could actively choose righteousness, so could nations. A nation could be, collectively and publicly, on God's side, and a nation on God's side had a fundamentally different relationship to its actions than a nation merely pursuing its interests. The revivalists themselves were not expansionists. Many of them were abolitionists. The moral energy of the awakening fed directly into the anti-slavery movement. But the theological architecture they had built, the idea that a nation could stand in covenant with God, could be actively fulfilling or actively betraying a divine purpose, was available for appropriation. O'Sullivan appropriated it, not cynically, with absolute conviction. The Democratic Review, in the years before the phrase, had been building toward it editorial by editorial. Each one argued that American democracy was not just one political system among many, but the most advanced form of human self-organization yet achieved, and that extending it across the continent was therefore not conquest but progress. Not taking, giving. The contradiction at the center of this position, the simultaneous belief in universal rights and the routine violation of those rights in the process of expansion, was not unique to O'Sullivan. It was the defining tension of American political culture in the first half of the 19th century. Other writers circled it, softened it, argued around it. O'Sullivan provided a phrase that made it possible to stop noticing it. The sentence, in its full context. And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government, entrusted to us. Every word is doing something specific. Listen to them one at a time. Manifest. The word means obvious, self-evident, requiring no argument. The thing that is manifest does not need to be proven. To question it is to reveal a deficiency in your own perception, not in the claim itself. Destiny, preordained, written in advance, not chosen, not decided, not debated, destined. The word removes human agency from the expansion and hands it to a force outside human control. We are not choosing to expand. We are fulfilling something already written. Providence, God but invoked obliquely, without using the word. Providence is softer, more abstract, less debatable than a direct claim of divine mandate. You can argue that God chose someone else. It is harder to file a legal objection against Providence. Entrusted, The difference between this word and taken is the entire moral architecture of the claim. We are not conquerors. We are stewards. The continent is not something we are seizing, it is something we have been given to hold on behalf of civilization, on behalf of history, on behalf of the development of human freedom. 11 words, one breath, an entire theology of conquest compressed into a phrase that could be reprinted, cited, and repeated by men who had never read the editorial. Within months, the phrase was in congressional speeches. Within a year, in newspaper editorials from New England to the Gulf Coast, Congressman Robert Winthrop of Massachusetts, no relation to the Puritan John Winthrop, though the echo was not lost, used it on the House floor in January 1846, in a debate about the Oregon Territory, to argue that the United States had a right to the Pacific coast that transcended the ordinary logic of negotiation and treaty. He was not an expansionist fire-breather. He was a moderate. The phrase was already working across political temperaments. O'Sullivan's framing had done something more elegant than defend the removal of indigenous peoples. It had made that removal structurally irrelevant. If the continent was allotted by Providence, the question of who was already living, there was no longer a legal question or an ethical question. It was a category error. God does not allot permanently occupied land. If the allotment was real, then the current occupants must, by definition, be temporary. The Puritan settlers had made a similar argument 2 centuries earlier using the Latin concept vacuum domicilium. Land not cultivated in the European manner is, legally and morally, unoccupied. The argument had a documented problem. The indigenous peoples of North America were not simply nomadic hunter-gatherers. Many farmed. The Cherokee grew corn, beans, and squash. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest had been farming in permanent stone settlements for centuries. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, managed an agricultural economy complex enough to sustain one of the most sophisticated political confederacies in the pre-European Americas. Vacuum domicilium was not a description of reality. It was a prior commitment wearing the costume of a legal principle. Manifest destiny was the same thing. More compact, less vulnerable to the specific objection that the land was visibly occupied. O'Sullivan published a second use of the phrase 4 months after the first. In December 1845. In the New York Morning News, this time in the context of the Oregon Territory dispute with Britain. The phrase had worked so efficiently in the Texas context that he needed it again. This time the audience was different. Not the people who were being displaced and could not challenge it in print, but Britain, a sovereign European power with its own territorial claims, its own legal standing, its own voice in the international press. Stand aside. This is our destiny. Providence is not subject to your treaty claims. The 11 words have been extended from domestic justification to foreign policy. A phrase that had begun as an explanation for what the country had done to its own interior became an argument addressed to the world. There is one dimension of O'Sullivan's editorial that tends to disappear in discussions of the phrase. The editorial was not primarily about land. It was about law. It was written in response to a specific legal argument that the annexation of Texas was illegal under international law and inconsistent with the Republic's treaty obligations with Mexico. O'Sullivan's response was not to refute the legal argument. It was to dissolve it. The question of whether the annexation was legally defensible was superseded, in his framing, by the question of whether it was providentially ordained. And Providence, by definition, supersedes law. Providence does not need legal authority. Providence is the authority. He did not argue against the law. He moved the debate to a register where law could not operate. This is the specific gesture that makes manifest destiny a political theological mechanism rather than merely a rhetorical one. And it is the gesture that will appear again in each episode this season in different eras, in different languages, wearing different names. The elevation of providential claim above legal question. The removal of the expansion from the domain where evidence and argument and treaty obligations apply. The most consequential thing O'Sullivan's phrase did, in the long run, was something he had not anticipated and would not have welcomed. It tore the country apart over slavery. In August 1846, 3 months into the war with Mexico, that his phrase had helped make politically legible, Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced a one-sentence rider to an appropriations bill. Slavery should be prohibited in any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot proviso passed the House twice. The Senate killed it twice. It was never enacted. But the debate it triggered could not be contained. O'Sullivan's phrase had made expansion feel inevitable, necessary, providential. It had not said anything about who, among the people doing the expanding, would benefit. Who would get the land? Whose labor would work it? Whether the divine appointment of the United States extended equally to all its citizens or only to some, the phrase papered over this question. But paper has limits. The question accumulated pressure for 14 years until it became the Civil War. The narrative that had united Americans behind expansion did not resolve their deeper disagreement. It postponed it. And what is postponed accumulates interest. O'Sullivan spent the rest of his life watching the phrase operate without him. He saw it cited in chambers he never entered, used to justify a war he had not specifically intended, embedded in the political vocabulary of a country that no longer needed his name attached to use his logic. Bet 1895. When he died in New York, having spent his later years largely in Europe, a minor figure of a previous era who had supported the Confederacy and been on the wrong side of the question, the Civil War resolved the phrase had become, in the political culture, something more than an argument. It had become an assumption, the kind of thing that no longer needs to be said because it has become the air inside which every other argument breathes. He gave the phrase away. The phrase never came back. There is a specific image from 1845 that stays with you if you look at it long enough. The Democratic Review's Nassau Street office was a short walk from the offices of Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, the paper that would become, over the next decade, one of the primary critics of the war that Manifest Destiny had helped make. Greeley and O'Sullivan occupied the same geography, read the same news, argued in some of the same rooms. They reached opposite conclusions about whether the expansion was legitimate. The difference was not information. They had access to the same facts. The difference was the prior commitment. O'Sullivan had one that the facts were embedded inside. Greeley did not. In the absence of the prior commitment, the facts looked different. O'Sullivan's phrase circulated not just through political speeches and newspaper editorials, but through a medium that is easy to underestimate in its importance, the Emigrant Guide. The 1840s produced a proliferation of printed guides for prospective settlers heading west, practical documents describing routes, conditions, the cost of provisions, what kind of land was available. Many of them incorporated the language of Manifest Destiny, often without attribution, as a frame for the journey being described. The move westward was not just practical migration. It was participation in a providential project. The individual settler was an agent of the national destiny. This framing made the journey feel larger than itself. It recruited people not just to a piece of land but to a role in history. The most widely read of these guides was Lansford Hastings's The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, published in 1845, the same year as O'Sullivan's editorial. Hastings had traveled the routes himself. His guide was practical and specific, distances, water sources, the condition of the passes in different seasons. It was also, in its framing sections, thoroughly suffused with the language of providential expansion. The West was waiting to be claimed by the people Providence had appointed to claim it. The journey was not a hardship to be endured, but a destiny to be fulfilled. Hastings' guide contributed, indirectly, to one of the most catastrophic events of the Gold Rush era, the Donner Party. His guide recommended a shortcut the Hastings cut off, that he had never actually traveled with a wagon party. The Donner Party attempted it in 1846, became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada, and of the 87 people who began the journey, 41 died, some of them in circumstances that subsequent investigation confirmed involved cannibalism. Hastings was not prosecuted. The guide continued to be used. The narrative of providential westward migration was not dented by the evidence of what the migration actually cost. The Donner Party was an aberration. The destiny was real. Before the phrase, there were people. The peoples who lived in the territories that the United States designated as its manifest destiny were not absences waiting to be filled. They were nations with legal systems, economies, diplomatic traditions, and in several cases, formal governmental structures as sophisticated as those of many European states. The Cherokee Nation, by the early 1830s, had a written language. Sequoia, a silversmith and soldier who had never attended a formal school, spent 12 years, roughly 1809 to 1821, developing a syllabary for the Cherokee language. It was completed. It worked within a few years of its introduction. The Cherokee literacy rate was higher than that of their white neighbors in Georgia. They had a bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. First issue dated February 21. Ishembabayashaba. Published simultaneously in English and Cherokee syllabary. They had a written constitution, ratified in 1827, modeled in part on the Constitution of the United States. They had a representative legislature, a bicameral structure, a system of courts. Their capital was New Exeter, in what is now northern Georgia, a planned town with a council house, a print shop, and a Supreme Court building. By every criterion the United States officially recognized as civilization. They were civilized. It changed nothing. The Indian Removal Act was signed by Andrew Jackson on May 28. Itembaba censure, 15 years before Sullivan's editorial. Before the phrase existed, this matters. The removal happened without the phrase. The phrase provided the retrospective justification and the prospective one for what would follow. Jackson's own justification was different from O'Sullivan's and worth understanding on its own terms. He did not invoke providence. He invoked protection. His argument, in his messages to Congress, was that the indigenous nations were surrounded by white settlers who would not respect their rights no matter what any government said. That removal to territory west of the Mississippi was therefore an act of mercy, a way to preserve what would otherwise be destroyed by proximity to a hostile population. He was not entirely wrong about the diagnosis. The state of Georgia had been violating Cherokee rights with impunity for years, passing laws that applied Georgia jurisdiction to Cherokee territory, harassing Cherokee citizens, seizing Cherokee land through fraudulent surveys. The federal government had done little to stop it. He was completely wrong about the remedy. In 1831, the Cherokee brought a case before the Supreme Court of the United States Cherokee Nation v. 5. Georgia. The court held that it lacked jurisdiction. The Cherokee were a domestic dependent nation, not a foreign state, and therefore could not sue directly. Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion was complicated, but embedded within it was a clear acknowledgement that the Cherokee had a form of sovereignty that they were not simply territory available for appropriation. The following year, Baba Censor, the court ruled again. Worcester Vistam, Georgia. This time the question was direct. Georgia had arrested a white missionary named Samuel Worcester, who was living on Cherokee land without a Georgia license. Georgia's position was that the Cherokee territory was subject to Georgia law. The court disagreed. 9-1. Marshall wrote the majority opinion. Georgia's laws can have no force within Cherokee territory. The Cherokee were a distinct community, occupying its own territory. Worcester must be released. The removal must stop. Andrew Jackson declined to enforce the ruling. Georgia continued to enforce its laws on Cherokee territory after the Worcester ruling. The missionaries who had been jailed Worcester and Eleazar Butler remained in prison. Georgia's governor refused to release them. The federal government did not compel compliance. Worcester and Butler spent 16 more months in prison before eventually agreeing to drop their case in exchange for release. The legal challenge was exhausted into withdrawal. Principal Chief John Ross continued to petition Congress, to write letters, to appear before committees, to argue the Cherokee case in the precise legal language the Republic claimed to respect. He did this for years. The removal happened anyway. The Cherokee Nation filed its last formal legal protest against the removal in 1838. As the Army was already constructing the stockades, the protest documented the legal violations, cited Worcester v. Georgia, appealed to treaty obligations the United States had voluntarily entered and then violated. It was filed, received, in the practical sense that mattered, ignored. The march began in the autumn. The snow came in November. 4,000 people died on the way to a territory they had not chosen. In a conflict the Republic had decided was finished. The exact words he reportedly used, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," may or may not have been spoken exactly as recorded. But the substance was accurate. The President of the United States, informed that the Supreme Court had ruled the removal unconstitutional, continued the removal. The Army was not turned back. The stockades being built in Cherokee territory were not torn down. The relocation program that had been set in motion continued to move. This sequence is worth holding in mind whenever the legal history of the removal is discussed. The removal was not legally uncontested. It was contested at the highest legal level the country possessed and won. The winning side still lost, because the mechanism, the prior commitment to expansion as providential necessity, operated above the law, not in defiance of it. Above it, in a register where the law's authority did not reach. The winter of 1838-39. The United States Army supervising a forced march of approximately 16,000 Cherokee from their homelands in Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma, 1,000 miles, conducted primarily on foot. In weather that turned brutal in November, the Cherokee called it Nunadol-Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Approximately 4,000 people died. The number is a rough estimate because the United States government did not keep systematic records of the deaths. The records that exist come primarily from Cherokee sources, testimonies of survivors, accounts from missionaries who accompanied the march, letters written by the soldiers who supervised it and sent home to families who had not been there. Private John G. Burnett was one of those soldiers. He wrote about what he had seen 50 years later, in 1819, in a memoir addressed to his children and grandchildren. He did not want what he had witnessed to go unrecorded. "I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes, and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades, And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. Chief John Ross led in prayer, and when the bugle sounded and the wagons started rolling, many of the children rose to their feet and waved their little hands goodbye to their mountain homes, knowing they were leaving them forever. Burnett was not exceptional. What he described was corroborated by other soldiers, by the missionary Daniel Boutrick, who traveled with the Cherokee, by the accounts of Cherokee survivors collected by the Bureau of Indian Affairs decades later. The documentary record of the Trail of Tears is extensive and consistent. It was absent from the political discourse of 1845. Not because no one knew, because the narrative being constructed had no grammatical slot for it. The Trail of Tears was not the first removal or the most numerically devastating. The Choctaw were removed first. Between 1,831 and 1,833, the First Nation forced out under the new act. Their experience establishing the pattern every subsequent removal would follow. George Gaines was a federal agent who supervised part of the Choctaw removal. He wrote in his private correspondence, not his official reports, that the operation was a disgrace. The promised provisions had not arrived. The contractors hired to supply transportation and food had been paid but had not delivered. People were dying not from the difficulty of the journey but from the specific, preventable failures of an administration that had contracted to make the journey survivable and had not. His private letters said this clearly. His official reports were more circumspect. The gap between the two documents is itself a form of evidence about what everyone involved understood was happening and what they were willing to put on the official record. The Creek removal of 1,836 was carried out partly in chains. The Creek had resisted through legal challenges and through the simpler strategy of not leaving. When federal patience was declared exhausted, the army came in. The Creek were transported partly by riverboat. Observers described the conditions on the boats as comparable to a slave ship, people packed into spaces designed for cargo. Without adequate food or ventilation or medical care, deaths occurred in transit. Bodies were put overboard. The Potawatomi of Indiana were removed in September 1838, the same autumn as the Cherokee March. Approximately 850 people. 660 miles to Kansas. 61 days. The weather was brutal that September and October. Approximately 40 people died. Mostly children. The Potawatomi named their march the Trail of Death. Father Benjamin Petit was a Catholic priest who accompanied the Potawatomi and administered last rites to the dying. He wrote to his superiors in the church, "What a spectacle! It would have moved the most insensible heart. They were surrounded by soldiers as if they were criminals. They were forced to leave at once without being given any time to make preparations. The sick, the aged, the children were all forced off without ceremony." His letter went to the diocese archives. It was not published. It was not cited in any congressional speech or newspaper editorial about the humanity or inhumanity of the removal policy. It joined the larger documentary record, the private letters, the missionary accounts, the survivor testimonies that accumulated throughout this period in the shadow of the official narrative. The evidence existed. The framework could not see it. The Seminole refused entirely, where other nations had fought through courts and petitions. The Seminole fought with weapons. The Second Seminole War began in December 1835 and lasted 7 years, the longest. Costliest Indian war in American history. The United States spent approximately $30 million and lost approximately 1,500 soldiers. The Seminole force at its height numbered perhaps a few thousand, operating from the swamps and hammocks of interior Florida, using tactics that no conventional military response could effectively counter. The war ended not with a Seminole defeat but with exhaustion. In the Third Seminole War, concluded in 1858, The United States effectively accepted that a remnant Seminole population would remain in Florida not because they had won, but because the cost of forcing them out had become politically unsustainable. The treaty was a concession of attrition, not of principle. Their descendants still live there, about 4,000 of them. The pattern of removal did not end with the 5 civilized tribes. It continued throughout the 19th century as the definition of Indian territory was progressively narrowed. The territory in Oklahoma to which the removed nations had been sent was guaranteed to them by treaty as permanent homeland and then renegotiated. Reduced. Allotted in severalty under the Dawes Act of 1887. And eventually incorporated into the state of Oklahoma in 1907. The removed peoples had been removed once to make room for the expansion. They were reorganized again, in a different form, to complete the legal process of state formation. The Osage Nation, who had been removed to a reservation in what became Osage County, Oklahoma, discovered in the early 20th century that the land beneath their reservation contained one of the largest oil deposits in North America. They had retained the mineral rights under their allotment agreements. For a period in the 1920s, the Osage were, per capita, the wealthiest people in the world. What followed was a systematic campaign of murder, fraud, and legal manipulation documented in David Grann's 2017 book, Killers of the Flower Moon, in which white settlers and opportunists, using guardianship laws and marriage fraud and outright assassination, transferred the Osage oil wealth to white ownership. The FBI investigated. Some convictions were obtained. The wealth largely transferred anyway. The Osage story is not a coda to the removal era. It is the removal era in its next iteration, the same basic mechanism, adapted to a different legal context and a different century. The land the removed peoples were given turns out to be valuable. The mechanisms by which that value is transferred to the people who had always been identified as its providential inheritors are different in each iteration. The result tends to be similar. O'Sullivan published his phrase in July 1845. By November, it had been cited in 4 separate congressional debates, reprinted in newspapers in at least 12 states, and adopted by politicians who had been making the argument for expansion for years without quite having vocabulary efficient enough to carry it. The removed nations, Cherokee and Indian Territory, Choctaw on the plains. The Seminoles still holding their remnant in Florida were not inside that vocabulary. They were not part of the phrase. They were what the phrase had been designed to make it possible to not think about. The word had arrived. The war was already forming. April 12, Iten Babai Sichalil. A small American reconnaissance force under Captain Seth Thornton is patrolling the north bank of the Rio Grande, in territory disputed between the United States and Mexico. Mexican cavalry crosses the river and engages them. 11 American soldiers are killed. The rest are taken prisoner. News reaches Washington 11 days later. President Polk had been looking for exactly this. The dispute about where the border between the United States and Mexico was had been running since the annexation of Texas. The United States claimed the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of Texas. Mexico claimed the Nueces River about 150 miles to the north as the recognized boundary of the province. Polk had ordered American troops into the disputed strip specifically, his critics argued, to provoke an incident. The incident had arrived. Polk's war message to Congress, delivered May 11, Iten Babai Sichalil, was a document that required, as its foundation, a particular account of what the disputed territory was. He described the land north of the Rio Grande as American soil. He described the Mexican cavalry crossing as an invasion. He described American blood as having been shed on American ground. Each of these framings assumed what was under dispute. The territory was not American soil except under the American claim, which was the claim being contested. But to call it disputed territory was to acknowledge that the United States had sent its army into a zone whose status had not been resolved. And that acknowledgement would undermine the narrative of an unprovoked attack. Polk used the language of the aggrieved party. Congress voted for war 2 days later. 174 to 14 inches the House, 40 to 2 inches the Senate. One of the 14 was John Quincy Adams. He was 78 years old. He had been the 6th President of the United States. He died in the Capitol building less than 2 years later, having continued opposing the war by every parliamentary means available. He did not stop it. In December 1847, a congressman from Illinois introduced a series of resolutions on the House floor demanding that President Polk identify the precise spot on American soil where the first American blood had been shed. If the spot was in the disputed territory north of the Rio Grande but south of the Nueces, then the war rested on a false premise. The resolutions became known as the Spot Resolutions. They went nowhere. Their author was told, by colleagues and by party leaders, that he had made himself unpopular. He did not seek re-election at the end of his term. His name was Abraham Lincoln. His district had been carried by the pro-war vote. He had calculated, correctly, that opposing the war was politically damaging in the short term. He would be back. That is another episode. What American accounts of the Mexican-American War consistently underweight is what the war looked like from Mexico City. Mexico, in 1845, was 24 years out of Spanish colonial rule. It was a republic, technically, but a fragile one, torn between regional factions, between liberals and conservatives, between the capital and the provinces, between the Catholic Church and the emerging secular state. It had been through 2 emperors, several provisional governments, and 11 different presidents in the first 20 years of its independence. It was not a state that had the administrative coherence or military capacity of the United States. Texas had been part of Mexico. Its loss first, through the American settler revolt that produced the short-lived Texas Republic in 1836. Then through annexation to the United States in 1845, was not experienced in Mexico as a manageable diplomatic setback. It was experienced as an amputation. The border question was not, in the Mexican political imagination, a technical dispute about which river was the natural boundary. It was a question of whether Mexico would have any effective sovereignty at all in its northern territories. When Polk's war message reached Mexico City through diplomatic channels, the Mexican Congress issued its own declaration of war on July 2. Ichen Babay Sicilio. The declaration used language that contrasted sharply with Polk's, where Polk invoked the suffering of American soldiers on American soil. The Mexican Declaration invoked the law of nations, the body of international legal principle that the United States had itself appealed to when asserting its own independence from Britain, where the American message made the war sound like a response to aggression. The Mexican Declaration described it as an act of aggression, a violation of Mexico's territorial sovereignty, a war that Mexico had not sought and was being forced to fight in its own defense. The Mexican Declaration was legally more accurate. The American message was politically more effective. The Mexican commander was Antonio López de Santa Anna, 11-time President of Mexico, veteran of the Alamo, a man who had once demanded a state funeral for his amputated leg, received it, and been re-elected afterward. He understood from the first weeks of the 1846 campaign that Mexico could not win a conventional military contest against the United States. His strategy was to make the war expensive enough in lives and in money that American domestic opposition would accumulate faster than the military outcome could be settled. The opposition was real. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln, Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio, who read the name of every American soldier killed into the congressional record, week by week, as a form of protest. Henry David Thoreau, who went to jail rather than pay taxes to a government fighting a war he considered unjust, and who wrote an essay about it that would eventually help shape the thinking of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. The anti-war movement was vocal, substantive, and bipartisan. It was too slow. Winfield Scott's army entered Mexico City in September 1847. The facts on the ground were established before the opposition had time to accumulate decisive political weight. This is the structural advantage of a war grounded in providential narrative. It generates enough momentum at the outset to carry operations through the period when opposition is building. By the time the opposition might have stopped it, the mechanism had already run. The military outcome was not in serious doubt from the beginning. American forces were better equipped and better supplied, and had been better prepared by decades of experience in the Indian Wars. The generals who led them, Taylor, Scott, Wool, had spent careers learning how to move armies across difficult terrain against mobile opponents. Mexico's military was courageous and in some battles effective, but it was fighting against an army with a logistical capacity it could not match. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed February 2. Ichinbaba Seshaba, Mexico ceded to the United States, California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. In total, approximately 525,000 square miles, roughly 55% of Mexico's pre-war territory. The United States paid Mexico $15 million. The payment was described as compensation, not a purchase price compensation. The distinction was important to the American negotiators. To call it a purchase would be to acknowledge that the transaction was commercial rather than the resolution of a military conflict. Compensation preserved the fiction that the transfer was not a forced sale. Approximately 100,000 Mexican citizens living in the ceded territory were given the option of relocating to Mexico or remaining in place as American citizens. Most stayed. The treaty guaranteed their property rights and citizenship. The guarantee was honored imperfectly. In a pattern that would become familiar, law on paper diverging from the reality on the ground. 9 days before the treaty was signed, 9 days a mill race was being dug at a sawmill on the American River in California's Central Valley. The man supervising the construction was James Marshall. He looked into the water and saw something glinting. Gold. The California gold rush began within months. By 1849, approximately 80,000 people had come to California. By 1852, approximately 250. Lim. The territory that Manifest Destiny had framed as divinely allotted had, beneath its soil, a material the 19th century considered the most concentrated form of worldly value. John Sutter, the Swiss-born entrepreneur who owned the land where gold was discovered, did not benefit from the rush he had accidentally triggered. Within 2 years, squatters had overrun his agricultural estate, stolen his cattle, demolished his buildings, and filed fraudulent legal claims against his land. He spent the rest of his life in litigation and died in 1880, effectively bankrupt, still petitioning Congress for compensation. The man who owned the land when destiny delivered its most famous confirmation was erased by the force of what followed. The rush produced, in its first 3 years, approximately 300,000 arrivals in California, people from the eastern United States, from Mexico, from Chile, from China, from Australia, from Europe. The gold rush was genuinely international in a way that American expansionist rhetoric was not. It attracted people who had no investment in Manifest Destiny's theological framework and who came simply because gold was available. The California that emerged from it was a society of extraordinary diversity and extraordinary violence, in which competing claims to resources were adjudicated less by law than by proximity to armed force. For believers, confirmation, Providence had delivered exactly what it promised. For the indigenous peoples of California, who had survived the Spanish mission system, only to face what came next. The gold rush was catastrophic beyond any previous event in the region's history. The population of indigenous Californians estimated at roughly 150, 0 inches, 1,848, fell to approximately 30, 0,870, through violence, through disease, through displacement from their food sources, through the destruction of the rivers and streams the mining operations required. California's first governor, Peter Burnett, called, in his 1851 State of the State address, for a war of extermination against the remaining native peoples of the state. This was the language of a state official in a public address. It was not unusual language for 1,851. It was the working out of what Manifest Destiny had always implied, but usually expressed in more elevated vocabulary. Ulysses S. Grant served as a brevet second lieutenant in the Mexican-American War. He was 24 years old. He had graduated from West Point and been assigned to the 4th Infantry. He participated in the battles of Palo Alto, Isaca de la Palma, Monterrey, and the Battle of Chapultepec. He was present at the fall of Mexico City. He wrote about the war in his memoirs in 1885, 40 years later, while dying of throat cancer, dictating to a stenographer because he could no longer speak clearly. He wrote, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time, when I was a youngster. Only I had not moral courage enough to resign." That last sentence carries more weight than the moral judgment before it. He knew. He was there. He participated in every engagement assigned to him with competence and courage. He did not resign. He did not refuse to serve. He did not write a letter to his congressman or a letter to a newspaper. He did his duty and, 40 years later, told his grandchildren what he thought his duty had been in service of. The mechanism does not require everyone to believe. It requires that the people who do not believe feel sufficiently isolated professionally, institutionally, socially that they go along. Grant was a lieutenant in wartime. His options were not numerous, but the structure of his situation, knowing and continuing, is the structure that makes every imperial project function. Not primarily the true believers. The people who know better and go along because the cost of refusal is higher than the cost of moral compromise. That is how it always runs. In every era, in every empire. The war ended in 1848. The phrase did not. It had barely started. Manifest Destiny, as a specific phrase, fell out of common political use by the end of the 19th century. The continental expansion it had named was complete. The phrase had served its purpose and retired into historical quotation. The structure did not retire with it. In July 1893, a 32-year-old historian from Wisconsin delivered a paper to the American Historical Association at a meeting held in Chicago. During the World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair commemorating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage. The timing was not accidental. The paper was called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier, the moving line between settled civilization and open wilderness, had been the defining source of American democratic character. The individualism, the self-reliance, the egalitarianism, the democratic energy that distinguished the United States from Europe, All of it, Turner argued, came from the experience of the frontier. The frontier was where Americans became American. The paper was delivered the same year the United States Census Bureau officially declared that the American frontier had ceased to exist. There was no longer a continuous line of settlement moving westward. A continent had been absorbed. Turner's thesis raised, without quite stating, an obvious and alarming question. If the frontier produced American democracy, and the frontier was gone, what came next? The answer American political culture gave within a few years was, find a new frontier. Turner's paper was not immediately celebrated. The audience at the 1893 meeting was modest. It was, after all, a professional conference session competing with the World's Fair outside. But within a decade, the frontier thesis had become the dominant framework in American historiography. Turner's students went on to teach at universities across the country. His ideas shaped how generations of Americans understood their own history and, crucially, shaped how politicians understood what the absence of a continental frontier implied for American policy. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901, had independently been developing similar ideas in his 4-volume history, The Winning of the West, published between 1889 and 1896. Roosevelt's version was more explicitly racial. He framed the westward expansion as the victory of the English-speaking peoples over lesser civilizations, but the underlying argument was structurally identical to Turner's. The expansion was the source of American vitality, and its conclusion was a problem that required a solution. Roosevelt's solution was what he called the strenuous life, the projection of American energy, military and commercial, outward across the Pacific and the Caribbean. The frontier had moved offshore. The naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan had provided the operational logic for this expansion in his 1890 book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan argued that great powers throughout history had been defined by their naval capacity, their ability to control sea lanes, establish overseas coaling stations, project power beyond their continental borders. The United States, in Mahan's analysis, was on the verge of either becoming a genuine great power or declining into continental irrelevance. The choice was whether to build a blue water navy and establish overseas bases, or remain a merely continental power in a world where that was becoming an increasingly constrained category. Turner, Roosevelt, 3 thinkers, 3 frameworks, all converging in the 1890s on the same conclusion. The continental expansion was over. The energy it had generated needed somewhere to go. The providential mission that O'Sullivan had named in 1845 needed a new geography. The Spanish-American War of 1898 provided it, and the justification, the language of civilizational mission, of providential appointment, of the burden and privilege of a people chosen to extend the benefits of their governance to peoples not yet ready to govern themselves, was O'Sullivan's structure, wearing new clothes. The Spanish-American War was, in one sense, manufactured. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World had been competing for years to produce the most dramatic coverage of the Cuban independence struggle against Spain. Their coverage was not false. In every particular, there were genuine atrocities, genuine suffering, genuine political repression. But the coverage was systematically framed to inflame American opinion, to make intervention feel both necessary and righteous. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, the cause still debated among historians. With accident as the most likely explanation, both papers ran screaming front pages attributing the explosion to Spanish sabotage. Remember the Maine became the rallying cry for intervention. The war began 3 months later. The providential narrative that underwrote the war was not invented by the newspapers. It had been available since O'Sullivan, had been restated in Turner's academic prose and Roosevelt's popular histories. The newspapers did not create the prior commitment to American civilizational mission. They activated it. They took the structure that had been built over 50 years of providential rhetoric and pointed it at a specific moment, a specific event, a specific opportunity. The explosion of the Maine was the trigger. The theology was already loaded. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain and, by the end of it, had acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and effective control over Cuba. The justification was not territorial or economic in its dominant public framing, though both were real factors. The dominant public justification was humanitarian. The people of these territories needed American guidance, American institutions, American civilization. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, speaking to the Senate on January 9, 1900, a speech that lasted 2 hours and was reported in full by newspapers across the country, said, "The Philippines are ours forever. And just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race. Trustee, under God, of the civilization of the world. Trustee, under God, of the civilization of the world." The phrase is different. The structure is identical to O'Sullivan's. The expansion is not chosen, it is a trust. Not self-interest, it is stewardship. Not power, it is mission. The language of Providence has been replaced by the language of racial civilization. But the underlying argument, we are not doing this for ourselves. We are doing it on behalf of something larger than ourselves, is unchanged. The Philippine-American War that followed is less familiar to American audiences than the Spanish-American War that preceded it, partly because its outcome was less clean. It lasted officially from 1899 to 1902, and in guerrilla form until 1913. American forces, many of them officers and soldiers who had served in the Indian Wars, employed methods developed in that context: the destruction of villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters, the internment of civilian populations in concentration zones, the use of torture in interrogation. One technique, which American soldiers called the water cure, involved forcing water down a prisoner's throat until the abdomen distended and then pressing on it to force the water out. It was widely used. It was reported in American newspapers. It was debated in Congress. The estimated death toll for Filipino civilians, primarily from disease and starvation in the internment zones, ranges from 200,000 to 250. 0 inches most scholarly accounts, with some estimates higher. This happened in the name of the same providential mission that had justified the Trail of Tears and the Mexican-American War. Different century, different people, same claim. The Cold War produced the mechanism's most sophisticated iteration, the one in which the providential claim was replaced by a claim that had the rhetorical advantage of sounding like science. The Soviet Union and the United States, in the decades after 1945, were not simply competing powers. They were competing teleologies, competing accounts of where history was going and which side was on the right side of its direction. Both sides believed, or performed the belief, that history had an inherent direction, that the direction pointed toward their respective models, and that opposing their expansion was therefore not merely a political disagreement but a failure to understand what history required. The American version of this was explicitly theological in some formulations and secular providential in others. President Ronald Reagan, in his farewell address in January 1989, used John Winthrop's image, "The City Upon a Hill," from the 1637 aboard the Arbella. the same image that had informed the political culture O'Sullivan was writing within, and described it as the animating vision of his presidency. I have spoken of the shining city all my political life. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, wind-swept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. God-blessed, a phrase Winthrop had used in 1630, the phrase that had underwritten the Puritan settlement, the Indian removal, the doctrine of manifest destiny, the Philippine annexation. 359 years later, the outgoing President of the United States was using it in his farewell address as the central image of American purpose. The phrase changes. The structure beneath it does not. The psychologist Leon Festinger documented in his 1956 study, When Prophecy Fails, something counterintuitive about what happens when a deeply held belief meets direct disconfirmation. He and his colleagues embedded themselves in a small apocalyptic group that had predicted the end of the world on a specific date in December 1954. The date passed. Nothing happened. Festinger expected the group to disintegrate. Most members became more committed. They did not conclude the prophecy was wrong. They concluded their prayers had saved the world. Or the date required recalculation. Or the failure was itself a test of faith whose successful navigation would strengthen the community. The disconfirmation was absorbed. The belief intensified. Festinger called the underlying dynamic cognitive dissonance reduction, the process by which people resolve the tension between deeply held belief and contradictory evidence not by revising the belief but by reframing the evidence. The reframing is not dishonest. The people doing it experience themselves as achieving greater clarity, not as manufacturing excuses. This is why the providential narratives this season examines are not defeated by the evidence against them. When manifest destiny produced a civil war, the war became a test and its outcome a vindication. When the Philippine-American War produced documented atrocities, the atrocities were aberrations, the mission remained valid. When the Iraq War produced not liberation but a decade of civil conflict, the mission remained necessary, the execution had failed, not the principle. In each case, the evidence against the claim is absorbed by the claim's own internal logic. This is not hypocrisy. It is the cognitive structure of unfalsifiable belief, and it is a property of the mechanism, not of any particular culture or era. Festinger identified 5 conditions that predict when belief will intensify rather than collapse after disconfirmation. The belief must be held with genuine conviction. The believer must have taken actions based on it. The disconfirmation must be specific and undeniable. The believer must have social support, other people who share the belief and will share the dissonance reduction together. And the disconfirmation must arrive at a moment when the social and psychological cost of abandoning the belief is higher than the cost of reinterpreting the evidence. Providential nationalist movements meet all 5 conditions almost by definition. The belief is genuinely held. The people who believed in manifest destiny were not, in the main, performing a belief they did not have. They had taken consequential actions based on it, voted, migrated, fought, signed treaties. The disconfirmations, the costs, the casualties. The gap between promise and reality was specific and undeniable. The believers had social support in the form of the entire dominant culture, and the cost of abandoning the belief was enormous. Because the belief was load-bearing, it was what made everything that had been done feel not like crime but like history. This is why providential narratives are not defeated by the evidence against them. They are defeated, if they are defeated at all, by the slow erosion of their social utility, by the moment when the gap between promise and reality can no longer be managed by the narrative's own internal resources, and when the cost of maintaining the narrative begins to exceed the cost of revising it, for manifest destiny specifically. That moment arrived gradually over the second half of the 19th century. Accelerating after the Civil War demonstrated that the expansion it had justified carried within it contradictions explosive enough to tear the country apart. The phrase faded, the structure adapted, and the adapted structure went looking for a new geography. The border in this photograph was drawn by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. It runs through territory that was, before 1848, part of Mexico and before Mexican independence in 1821, part of the Spanish Empire and before European contact, the territory of the Tohono O'odham, the Cocopa, the Quechan, the Kumeyaay, and other peoples who did not recognize it as a border at all. The border is enforced today by a federal agency with a budget of approximately $25 billion per year. The justification for the border for its precise location, for its existence as the political line it is, traces directly to a war that Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in it, called the most wicked war the United States had ever waged. The mechanism ran. The border remains. That is what mechanisms do. Before we leave O'Sullivan and 1845, one final thing to establish. Not about manifest destiny specifically. About the structure underneath it, the structure that will appear in every episode this season. The structure has 5 components. First, the gap. A society is doing something expanding, displacing, invading that its stated values cannot comfortably accommodate. The gap creates a narrative need. Second, the filling. Someone provides a phrase, a theology, a scientific law, a historical inevitability that reframes the expansion as something other than choice, not conquest fulfillment, not invasion arrival, not taking, receiving what was always meant to be received. Third, the mobility. The phrase or concept is compact enough to travel, resonant enough to feel true before it is analyzed, and positioned precisely at the point where a population's prior commitments were already searching for language. Fourth, the erasure. The people who bear the cost of the expansion are repositioned within the narrative as beneficiaries of civilization, as obstacle to progress, as peoples not yet ready for the gift being given to them at their expense. They are not absent from the story. They are present in it in a way that does not require accounting for what is being done to them. Fifth, the unfalsifiability. When the expansion produces costs, the costs are reframed as tests. Aberration. The price of progress. Evidence that the mission is more necessary than previously understood. The mission remains intact, regardless of what happens. Different era, different empire, different phrase, same structure. Season 3 will trace this structure across 6 nations and 6 eras. Episode 2 investigates the claim to a 1,000-year German empire, a claim that did not originate with Adolf Hitler, but with centuries of German mystical nationalism that his movement weaponized with extraordinary precision, giving an ancient theological fantasy a specific political deadline and a bureaucratic infrastructure for its fulfillment. Episode 3, Muhammad Ahmad al-Mahdi, who in 1881 declared himself the awaited Mahdi of Islamic prophecy and built, from a cotton farmer in the Sudan, a movement that held the largest empire in the world at bay for 15 years. What happens when a providential claim is made by someone at the bottom of the colonial hierarchy against the empire at the top of it? Episode 4, Hong Xuan, who in 1837 received a vision during a fever that told him he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, tasked by God with establishing a heavenly kingdom on earth in southern China. 20 million people died in the civil war that followed. It is the deadliest conflict of the 19th century and remains largely unknown outside Asia. Episode 5. The Soviet Union's claim that historical materialism was not prophecy but science, a distinction that made no practical difference, because the function of the claim was identical. It removed the expansion of Soviet power from the domain of human choice and placed it in the domain of historical law. Episode 6. Imperial Japan's doctrine of Kokutai, the divine national polity, and the belief that the emperor was literally descended from the gods, and that Japan's expansion across Asia was the working out of a divine mandate. And what happens when a living god has to use a radio broadcast, for the first time in history, to tell his people they have lost? The details differ. The structure does not. O'Sullivan was not a powerful man. He was a writer with a magazine and an idea that answered a need. He did not order the removal. He did not lead the army into Mexico. He did not draw the border. He gave the people who did those things a word for what they were doing. It is worth holding. One more time, the specific geography of the phrase's origin. Nassau Street in Lower Manhattan in 1845 was roughly 200 meters from the courthouses where property disputes were adjudicated under New York law, and roughly 4,000 kilometers from the territory in what is now Oklahoma, where the removed nations were living on land the United States had guaranteed to them by treaty. The phrase was written in proximity to the law, surrounded by the physical apparatus of the legal system, and it was addressed to a situation 4,000 kilometers away, where the legal system had already been overridden by the political will to expand. O'Sullivan did not need to travel to Indian Territory to write about manifest destiny. The distance was the point. The distance was what made the phrase possible. This is the final thing to say about the mechanism before Season 3 moves to its next case study. The providential narrative is, structurally, a product of distance, geographic distance, cultural distance. The distance between the people who construct the justification and the people who bear its costs. O'Sullivan did not see the stockades being built in Cherokee, Georgia. He did not see the marchers in the rain. He was in New York, writing about Providence. The gap between where the narrative is made and where its consequences fall is not incidental. It is the condition that makes the narrative possible. If O'Sullivan had been in the stockades, if the people who wrote the editorials and gave the congressional speeches had been required to be present at the consequences, the narrative would have had to work much harder, or would not have worked at all. A word that made it sound like something other than what it was. That moved it from the category of choice where it could be examined, contested, refused into the category of destiny, where examination became confusion and refusal became error. That is what a phrase can do when it is compact enough to travel, and resonant enough to feel true, and positioned precisely where a population's prior commitments are waiting for language. It can do everything. That is the oldest weapon in history. It has no blade. It has a phrase, and the phrase, once spoken, travels faster than any army